The soft murmur of the wedding ceremony fades as my grandson, Caleb, tugs at my sleeve, his voice barely a whisper. "Grandma, look under the table." Still, I don't react, thinking it's just his usual fidgeting until I see his wide eyes. Something's wrong. As I lean down, the faint scent of roses mingles with a strange tension in the air, and my breath catches. While the guests smile, unaware, my heart begins to race. The realization hits. My daughter Hannah's groom, David, is hiding something beneath the table. That's when I know. Everything about this wedding is a lie. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence. It lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Eleanor stood at the back of the ballroom, her eyes sweeping over the crowd, the grand chandeliers overhead casting a soft, golden glow on everything. It was the kind of wedding that could have been a picture in a magazine, elegant, flawless, everything in its place. Her daughter, Hannah, was the perfect bride, glowing in a gown that shimmered like liquid silver under the lights. Eleanor couldn't help but feel a rush of pride. But there was something else, too, something uneasy lodged in the pit of her stomach. She tried to ignore it. This was a day for celebration, a day for family, but it didn't feel quite right. As the ceremony continued, Eleanor shifted slightly, adjusting the long sleeves of her jacket, trying to get comfortable on the plush velvet chair. The music played softly in the background, a soothing sound that was almost enough to drown out the tight knot in her chest. She glanced down at Caleb, her young grandson, seated beside her. His small hand was tightly clutching the edge of his seat, his brow furrowed, and his little eyes darting around the room. Just as the officiant began to speak, Caleb tugged on her sleeve, his voice a soft whisper. "Grandma, look under the table." Eleanor's first instinct was to brush it off. Caleb was always fidgeting, always needing her attention during these formal occasions. Weddings were long, and she could tell his restlessness was getting the best of him. But there was something in the urgency of his tone that made her pause. She bent down closer to him, lowering her voice. "What is it, sweetheart?" His eyes, wide and round, stared at her. "Look," he whispered again, a little more insistent. "Under the table." Eleanor felt a slight chill creep down her spine, but she kept her composure, her gaze flicking to the ornate tablecloth that draped down to the floor, hiding whatever was underneath. She told herself it was just a child's imagination, that there was nothing there but the polished wood of the floor. But as the ceremony went on, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She glanced over at David, the groom. His face was hard to read, his usual easy charm nowhere to be found. He stood next to Hannah, his eyes focused somewhere off in the distance, his posture stiff, as if he were merely going through the motions. He didn't make eye contact with anyone, least of all his bride. His smile, when it did appear, was thin, fleeting, almost forced. Eleanor's instinct told her there was more to the man than the charming, polished facade he wore for the world. But she wouldn't be the one to break the illusion, not today. Not when her daughter had worked so hard to make everything perfect. Hannah, meanwhile, was radiant, but there was a strain in her expression, a tautness to her smile as she looked around, making sure every detail of the ceremony was going according to plan. She gave instructions to the photographer with sharp precision, barely pausing to catch her breath, her movements more mechanical than joyful. Eleanor's heart ached for her daughter. Hannah had always been meticulous, but today there was something about her energy that was more about control than celebration. Eleanor turned her gaze back to David, watching his stiff posture, the way his jaw tightened whenever someone spoke to him. She'd seen him like this before, cold, distant. It was like a wall had been erected between him and the rest of the room, and Eleanor had the strange sense that he was trying to keep something hidden. She wasn't sure what, but she felt it, the way he avoided looking at Hannah directly, the way he seemed to recoil whenever she got too close. And then, just as the officiant asked the couple to exchange their vows, Eleanor felt a deep, uncomfortable ripple pass through her. It wasn't a physical thing, but rather an emotional undercurrent that she couldn't ignore. It was a subtle shift in the air, a weight pressing down on the moment, as though something had gone wrong, something unspoken was hovering just beneath the surface. She looked at Hannah, standing tall in her beautiful dress, and her heart twisted. Was this really the wedding her daughter had dreamed of? Or was it something else entirely? Caleb tugged on her sleeve again, more urgently this time. "Grandma, please look." Eleanor shook her head, blinking away the odd sense of foreboding that had settled over her. "Not now, darling," she whispered, but this time there was no hiding the unease in her voice. Her instincts were screaming at her. Something was wrong. She couldn't explain it, but she felt it. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. She looked around once more. The guests were watching the ceremony with polite smiles, the hum of their murmurs blending into the music. But in the midst of it all, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something. She leaned back in her chair, taking a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She wanted so much for this day to be perfect, for Hannah, for Caleb, for herself. But something in her bones told her that this perfect wedding wasn't the happy occasion it appeared to be. As the ceremony neared its end, Eleanor felt an overwhelming need to protect her family, to make sure nothing at all, was going to ruin this day. But how could she protect them from something she couldn't even name? The tension in her chest grew tighter, and as the officiant pronounced David and Hannah man and wife, Eleanor's eyes locked on her daughter's face. Hannah was smiling, but her eyes were full of something Eleanor couldn't quite place. Doubt, maybe, or fear. It didn't matter. The wedding was over, but Eleanor knew one thing for sure. The real story was only just beginning. The reception was in full swing, the grand ballroom now filled with the hum of conversations, the clinking of glasses, and the soft murmur of laughter. The band played a light, jazzy tune in the background, but to Eleanor, it all felt like noise, unwelcome, hollow, like an illusion, meant to mask something much darker beneath the surface. She sat at a corner table, her eyes scanning the crowd, watching Hannah and David greet guests with smiles that felt too rehearsed, too polished. Eleanor's fingers rested on the edge of her glass, the champagne barely touched, its bubbles now a distant memory. She hadn't seen Caleb in a while, and when she turned her head, she found him seated alone by the edge of the room, his small face a study of concentration. He didn't seem interested in the festivities at all. His body was hunched, his hands wringing together in a nervous, almost compulsive motion. Eleanor's chest tightened. She stood up, excusing herself from the table with a faint smile, her movements slow and deliberate. She made her way through the crowd, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor, until she reached Caleb. He looked up as she approached, his eyes wide with something that bordered on alarm. "Grandma, I don't like it here," he said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. "I want to go home." Eleanor knelt down beside him, smoothing the fabric of his suit jacket. "I know, darling, we'll leave soon. But for now, how about we find you something sweet to eat? Would that make you feel better?" Caleb nodded, though his eyes never fully brightened. His unease was palpable, like a shadow that refused to lift. She kissed the top of his head and turned to make her way back to the main hall when something caught her eye, a glimpse of an envelope in David's hand. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but there was something about the way he gripped it that made her pulse quicken. She couldn't place why, but the urgency in his movements sent a ripple through her. She watched as David excused himself from the group, slipping out toward the back of the room. Eleanor's gaze followed him for a moment, her curiosity piqued. She was about to turn away when, in the split second before he disappeared, the envelope, bright white against the dark wood of the table, slipped from his hand and fell to the floor. The noise was faint, almost drowned out by the chatter around her, but it was enough to make her step forward. She bent down, her fingers brushing the edge of the envelope. It was unmistakable now, the word urgent written across it in sharp black ink. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. She glanced around quickly, making sure no one was watching. Then, as casually as possible, she picked it up and slipped it into her clutch. She stood back up, glancing toward David, who was still engaged in conversation across the room. He hadn't noticed a thing. Her mind raced as she turned toward the private suite she had reserved for the evening. The weight of the envelope in her purse felt heavier with each step. She had no idea what she was walking into, but she couldn't ignore the compulsion to know. Once inside, the door clicked shut behind her with an almost ominous finality. Eleanor placed the clutch on the table, her hands trembling slightly. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before she pulled out the envelope. The paper was stiff, the seal cracked but intact. It wasn't a letter that had been tossed aside. It was something meant to be kept, something important. She opened it slowly, her fingers brushing the edge of the paper. The words inside were neatly written in a rushed, scrawling hand. As Eleanor read, her breath caught in her throat. "David, please don't do this. Please reconsider. Our family isn't over. I know you think you've moved on, but I'm still here, still waiting for you. I need you to come back. I can't do this alone. Please don't marry her. It's not too late." Eleanor's eyes widened. The plea was desperate, raw, an admission of something Eleanor had suspected but hadn't wanted to confront. This wasn't just a letter from an ex-wife trying to win back a lost love. This was a call for help, a cry from someone still entangled in David's past, someone whose grip on him wasn't as easily severed as it appeared. David had kept this from Hannah. He'd kept it hidden from everyone. But why? Why keep something so significant locked away? And more importantly, what was he hiding from his fiancée? Eleanor's stomach twisted with the thought. She had seen the way David avoided her daughter's gaze, the coldness in his eyes whenever he spoke to her. But this was something else. This was more than just unresolved feelings. This was something far deeper. Eleanor's fingers gripped the edge of the paper, the ink smudging slightly under her trembling hand. "It's not too late," the words repeated in her mind. Her breath quickened, her pulse hammering in her ears. She stood up abruptly, pacing back and forth across the room. The letter felt like a time bomb in her hands, something that could either tear the family apart or, worse, destroy the carefully crafted facade of the perfect wedding. But what if this wasn't just about David's past? What if Hannah didn't know? What if she was walking into a marriage blind to the truth? Eleanor couldn't shake the thought, her mind spinning. She knew she had to confront David. She had to ask him about this letter. But what if he denied everything? What if Hannah didn't believe her? She looked down at the letter again, her chest heavy with a mix of anger and confusion. Something was breaking, something inside of her, but she couldn't yet see what. The future, her daughter's future, was hanging in the balance, and the truth was far more dangerous than she could have imagined. The silence in the private suite was almost unbearable. Eleanor stood by the window, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of the envelope, still clenched tightly in her other hand. The sound of distant music and laughter from the ballroom seeped into the room, but it felt miles away. She could barely focus on it. Her thoughts were consumed by the words she'd just read. It's not too late. Her heart was still racing, and her mind was spinning with 100 possibilities. What was she supposed to do with this? Should she confront David here and now, before the night unraveled any further? Should she confront Hannah? No, that would destroy her. But something had to be done. The weight of the decision pressed on her, and in that moment, Eleanor knew she needed someone who could see through the noise, someone who could help her make sense of what was happening. Monica, her lifelong friend, who'd been through every joy and heartbreak with her, the one person she trusted without question. She didn't hesitate. Taking a deep breath, Eleanor grabbed her phone from the table and dialed Monica's number. The first ring echoed in her ear, then the second, and finally, the third. When Monica picked up, her voice was light, but Eleanor could hear the warmth in her tone. "Eleanor, darling, how's the wedding? Is it all going smoothly?" Eleanor swallowed, trying to steady herself. Her voice felt tight, but she forced the words out. "Monica, it's not. It's worse than I thought. I found something. A letter. It's from David's ex. She's begging him to reconsider the marriage." Monica's response was immediate, her voice sharp with concern. "What? What does it say?" Eleanor closed her eyes, the letter's words still haunting her. "She says it's not too late, that they're still family, that he's making a mistake marrying Hannah. It's too much, Monica. It's not just an ex-wife trying to make amends. This is something deeper." Monica was quiet for a beat, the kind of silence that stretched uncomfortably between them. "You have to confront him, Eleanor. Don't let this go. The longer you wait, the worse it'll get. Hannah deserves to know the truth." Eleanor turned to the window, looking out over the dimming skyline of Southern California. I want to. I do. But I don't want to ruin this day. I don't want to tear my family apart. Not like this. There was a long pause, and Eleanor could practically hear Monica pacing on the other end. Do you really think keeping quiet will protect them, though? What if it's worse than you're imagining? What if David's hiding something else? You owe it to Hannah to uncover the truth now, before she walks into a marriage based on lies. Eleanor's throat tightened as the weight of Monica's words settled in. She had spent a lifetime trying to protect her family from pain, but the truth had a way of clawing its way to the surface, whether you were ready for it or not. I know, Eleanor whispered, her voice faltering. I know, but how do I even start? He'll deny it. He'll just brush me off. And what if Hannah doesn't believe me? What if she's too far gone with him? Monica's voice softened. Then you'll show her. You'll show her the truth. It's messy, Eleanor. But you can't let fear of what might happen keep you from doing the right thing. You've been strong enough for everyone else. Now it's time to be strong for her. Eleanor squeezed her eyes shut. Monica was right, of course. She couldn't keep pretending like everything was fine when it so clearly wasn't. Her family deserved the truth, no matter how painful it might be. I'm meeting David after the reception, Eleanor said quietly. I need to talk to him. Ask him what's going on. I need to understand. If he's hiding something, I need to know what it is. Monica was silent for a moment, then said firmly, You have to confront him, Eleanor, and don't back down. If he's hiding something, he's not just hurting Hannah. He's hurting you too. You deserve to know what kind of man he really is. The call ended with a click. But Eleanor didn't hang up immediately. She stood still for a moment, holding the phone in her hand, feeling the pulse of anxiety race through her veins. She knew Monica was right, but the fear of the unknown loomed over her. What would she uncover? What kind of man was David, really? Suddenly, she heard footsteps outside the door. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. She turned just in time to see Caleb standing in the doorway, his small face drawn with worry. He hadn't come in since she left him earlier, and now his presence filled the room with a different kind of weight. Grandma? Caleb's voice was soft, barely above a whisper. He shifted from foot to foot, his hands still wringing together. I don't want to go back out there. It's not right. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she saw the fear in his eyes, the same unease she had felt in the pit of her stomach. He was scared, too. It wasn't just the wedding, or the guests. Something was wrong, and he knew it. She walked toward him, her hand reaching out instinctively to comfort him. It's okay, sweetheart, she said gently, her voice shaking just a little. We'll get through this, I promise. But as she pulled him into her arms, her mind raced. She had a choice now. Confront David, dig into the past, uncover the secrets, or shield her family from the truth. But deep down, Eleanor knew that no matter what she chose, the truth had a way of finding its way to the surface, and she couldn't protect anyone from that. The moment passed with an unsettling stillness, and as she looked down at Caleb, his face full of innocence and trust, she knew what she had to do. The choice had been made. But the consequences were far from clear. Eleanor's palms were slick with sweat as she stood in the quiet hallway outside the private suite. Her heart raced, every step feeling heavier than the last. She could hear the faint hum of music from the ballroom, the laughter of guests, the clinking of glasses, worlds away from the storm swirling inside her. She had the letter in her pocket, still creased from where she'd held it earlier. She was about to do something she knew could unravel everything. David was standing at the bar in the corner of the room, holding a glass of whiskey, his face still tight with that same false smile. He hadn't noticed her yet, and for a moment, Eleanor hesitated. Maybe it would be easier to let it go, to step back into the role of the supportive mother, to pretend everything was fine and protect her daughter from the truth. But the weight of the letter, the weight of Caleb's unease, pressed too hard on her chest. She couldn't back away now. She took a breath, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor as she walked toward him. David turned as she approached, his smile faltering when he saw the seriousness in her face. Eleanor, he said, his voice still smooth, but there was a flicker of something, wariness, behind his eyes. I didn't expect to see you alone. Is everything all right? Eleanor's stomach churned at the sight of him. He was a perfect picture of the charming fiancé, but beneath that exterior, something was wrong. She couldn't put her finger on it, but it was there. She had seen the way he avoided her daughter's gaze, the way he distanced himself, the way he reacted when no one was looking. And now, there was this letter. She couldn't ignore it, not anymore. "I need to talk to you, David," Eleanor said, her voice steady but laced with an edge. David's posture stiffened. "About what?" Without answering him directly, Eleanor pulled the letter from her bag and held it up between them. "This." He froze, his face going pale, but only for a moment. The mask quickly snapped back into place. "What's this?" His voice was too casual, too calm. "Where did you get that?" Eleanor didn't back down, her eyes never leaving his. "I found it. I read it. From your ex-wife. She's begging you to reconsider your marriage to Hannah." David's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking away from hers. "It's nothing. Just a misunderstanding," he said, his tone flat. "Old wounds, nothing more. She's just upset, trying to get under my skin. You know how it is with exes." Eleanor's blood ran cold. He wasn't even trying to pretend this wasn't important. He was dismissing it, minimizing it. She saw the cracks in his facade, and it terrified her. "A misunderstanding?" she repeated, her voice shaking slightly. "That's what you're going with?" David's eyes darkened, his composure slipping just a little. "Eleanor, this is none of your business. You shouldn't be going through my things. That's not your place." She flinched at the anger in his voice, but it didn't stop her. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to back down now. "It's my daughter's business. It's my family's business," she shot back, her voice rising. "You think you can just sweep this under the rug and pretend it doesn't matter? That it's nothing?" David's hand clenched around his glass, his knuckles turning white. His lips curled into a tight smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You have no idea what you're talking about, Eleanor. This is between me and Hannah. Stay out of it." Eleanor's pulse hammered in her ears. She wanted to slap that smile off his face, but she held herself in check. She couldn't let him intimidate her, not anymore. "If you really love her, David, you won't keep lying. You won't keep hiding things. You owe her the truth." David's voice dropped to a low growl. "I don't owe you anything." The words landed like a slap, and for a moment, Eleanor felt dizzy. But it wasn't fear she felt, it was betrayal. Her mind screamed at her that she had to protect her daughter. She couldn't trust this man, not anymore. "I'm not going to stay quiet," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I'm going to tell Hannah everything. You don't get to tear this family apart." David's face darkened, his eyes flashing with something dangerous. He took a step forward, his breath coming quicker now, his composure cracking. "You think you're helping her? You're only making things worse. Just leave it alone, Eleanor. Let it go." Eleanor took a step back, her heart hammering in her chest. She knew she had crossed a line. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy, like something was about to snap. She couldn't stop now. She wouldn't. Before she could respond, the sound of a small voice broke through the tension. "Grandma?" Eleanor turned quickly, her breath catching in her throat. Caleb was standing in the doorway, his small face pale, his eyes wide with worry. He looked up at her, his hands twisting together nervously. "Caleb?" Eleanor whispered, rushing toward him. "What are you doing here?" He didn't answer immediately, his gaze shifting to David. "I don't like him, Grandma. He's not nice to you." His voice was soft, but the words hit Eleanor like a punch in the gut. David froze, his eyes flickering with something unreadable, but he didn't move. Caleb's words hung in the air like an accusation, and Eleanor's heart clenched painfully. Her mind raced, but there was no more time for doubts. Caleb had already seen what she was trying to protect him from. And as much as she wished things could be different, Eleanor knew she couldn't keep pretending. The truth had already begun to come out. The quiet thud of Caleb's words echoed in the room, and suddenly, everything felt like it was teetering on the edge. What would she do next? What more would she uncover about David? And how would she keep her family intact as the secrets continued to unravel? The reception carried on around Eleanor like a scene from a distant, detached movie. The music swelled, glasses clinked in rhythmic celebration, and guests laughed, polite, formal laughter that seemed to echo off the gilded walls of the ballroom. But to Eleanor, it all felt hollow, like a carefully constructed set, meant to hide a much darker truth. David and Hannah moved through the crowd together, their faces fixed in expressions that bordered on mechanical. Eleanor watched them, her eyes tracing their every step, every glance they exchanged. The way David's hand lingered on Hannah's back, just a little too stiff, too controlled. The way Hannah's smile, though bright, didn't quite reach her eyes. There was no warmth between them, not the easy comfort Eleanor had imagined, not the connection that should have been there on such an important day. It was like a facade, a beautifully crafted lie that everyone seemed to be willing to pretend was true. Eleanor's chest tightened. This is not right, she thought, her gaze never leaving the couple. Every word, every laugh, every gesture felt rehearsed, like they were playing roles in a drama neither of them had written, but both were trapped in. David's eyes avoided hers now, no longer the casual charm they once held. Instead, they were cold, calculating, and Eleanor could see the darkened shadows there, the part of him that was always just out of reach, the part that couldn't fully mask itself anymore. She'd thought that by now, she'd know exactly how this would play out, that she'd find a way to keep the peace. But the longer she watched, the more the truth clawed at her. It was all slipping away. The illusion of the perfect wedding, the fantasy of a daughter happily marrying the man she loved, was crumbling under the weight of what she knew, and what she still didn't understand. The crowd parted for a moment, and Eleanor caught a glimpse of Caleb, his small figure standing at the edge of the room, watching his mother and the groom. His expression was unreadable, but there was something about him that felt far older than his 8 years. He was standing completely still, as if in deep thought, his little hands twisting nervously in front of him. Eleanor's heart squeezed. He was catching on. She could see it. His young mind was putting the pieces together even faster than she was. He wasn't fooled by the smiles, by the polite conversation, or the well-choreographed toasts. Caleb knew, on some primal level, that something wasn't right. The perfect wedding mask was slipping for him too. She walked over to him, kneeling down to meet his gaze. His wide, brown eyes looked up at her with a mixture of confusion and concern. "Grandma," he said softly, his voice tinged with a kind of wisdom that startled her. "They're pretending everything is okay." Eleanor's throat tightened at the words. She placed a hand gently on his shoulder, her heart aching for him, for herself, for what had become of their family. "I know, sweetheart," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But sometimes we have to wait for the right moment. We have to be patient." Caleb nodded solemnly, but his gaze never wavered from the newlyweds across the room. The room buzzed with noise, but to Eleanor, everything felt distant, muffled. It was as if she were living in 2 worlds at once, one where the wedding was still going on, still in full swing, and another, darker world where the truth was rising to the surface like a tidal wave, threatening to swallow them all. She stood up, glancing over at David and Hannah. They were now talking to another guest, but the gap between them seemed wider than ever. Hannah laughed at something David said, but the laugh was too sharp, too forced. It didn't reach her eyes. David said something else, and Hannah nodded, but there was no joy in her face. Just a tight, controlled expression, like someone holding on to something, perhaps a dream or a promise that had already started to fade. Eleanor's chest tightened again. This wasn't just about David's lies. It was about the damage they would do, the wreckage they'd leave behind if things were allowed to continue. She had tried to protect her daughter for so long, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized that the only way to protect her now was to expose the truth. But how? How could she do it without tearing everything apart? She glanced at the clock above the bar. Time was running out. If she didn't do something soon, the evening would pass, and they would all be stuck pretending again. The reception would end, the guests would go home, and everything would go back to the way it was. Except it would never be the same. David was no longer the man she had welcomed into her family. He was a stranger, a manipulator, a liar, someone who had already betrayed them all. Her hand reached for her phone, instinctively dialing Charlie's number. The line rang twice before Charlie's familiar voice came through. "Eleanor, is everything all right?" She hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on her chest. "I need your help. I need you to look into David's past. I think he's hiding something from all of us." There was a brief silence, and then Charlie's voice, steady as ever, replied, "I'll get on it right away, but, Eleanor, be careful. The truth isn't always what we expect it to be." Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, her heart in her throat. She didn't know how deep this would go. She didn't know what she would find. But one thing was clear. She could no longer wait. The facade had cracked, and it was only a matter of time before everything came tumbling down. Her eyes swept back over to David and Hannah. The dance floor was filling. Guests were laughing. The evening was continuing with an air of normalcy, but Eleanor knew that it wouldn't last. Something had to give, and she would make sure it did. The truth had begun to unravel. It was just a matter of time before it tore everything apart. The evening had shifted, becoming something Eleanor no longer recognized. The glitzy reception was over, and the family dinner awaited, an opportunity for everyone to unwind, to exchange pleasantries over a glass of wine, to pretend everything was fine. But Eleanor couldn't bring herself to walk back into that world, not after everything that had happened. The calm facade had cracked. The veneer of the perfect wedding, the perfect couple, had already started to crumble, and she couldn't ignore it. As she stood at the edge of the hotel room window, staring out at the bright lights of the city below, Eleanor felt the weight of the night settle on her shoulders. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass, a woman torn between the desire to protect her family and the overwhelming need to expose the truth. She had watched David and Hannah through the evening, seen the cracks in their interactions, felt the tension in the air. It was impossible to ignore now. But it wasn't just about them. It was about Caleb, too. She could still see the look on his face when he'd quietly told her, "They're pretending everything is okay." Her fingers curled around the letter again, its edges now soft from handling, the ink smeared where she'd touched it repeatedly. "It's not too late." The words still echoed in her mind. She had seen David's cold reaction to the letter, the way he tried to brush it off like it was nothing. But she knew better now. There were too many signs, too many things he'd hidden. Eleanor sat down at the small desk by the window, spreading the letter out before her. Her eyes scanned the words again, this time with more focus. She had read it a dozen times already, but tonight it felt different. This time, the phrases that had once seemed like desperate pleas now seemed like red flags. "I can't do this alone. Don't marry her." Her stomach churned as she read the lines again, as if each word was digging deeper into a truth she didn't want to face. David's ex-wife had begged him to come back, not just emotionally, but in a way that was impossible to ignore. It's not just about her being upset, Eleanor thought. She's afraid of something. But what? What exactly was David hiding from everyone? Her phone buzzed, interrupting her spiraling thoughts. It was Monica. "Eleanor, how are you holding up?" Monica's voice came through the phone with a warmth that made Eleanor's throat tighten. I don't know anymore, Monica," Eleanor replied, sinking back into the chair. "This wedding, everything, it's unraveling. I've seen it. There's something about David, something he's not telling us. I found the letter from his ex, and now I can't stop thinking about it." Monica was quiet for a moment. "Eleanor, I know you want to protect Hannah, but you can't ignore the truth." "Not this time." Eleanor closed her eyes, the words cutting through her like glass. "I know, but what if exposing the truth ruins everything? What if I push her away and she doesn't believe me?" Monica's voice softened. "If you don't tell her now, Eleanor, she'll never trust you. Trust in family. You have to be strong, even if it's painful. For her." Eleanor stood up, pacing the small space. She wanted to reach out, to do something, anything, to stop the weight pressing down on her chest. But everything felt like it was spiraling beyond her control. "I don't know what to do. I feel like I'm losing control of everything." "Call Frank," Monica said gently. "Your late husband's lawyer. He might be able to give you some advice. You need to know what's at stake. If David's involved in something worse than just emotional manipulation, you need to understand what it means legally, for you, for Hannah, for Caleb. I know it's a lot, but you need to have a plan. Eleanor nodded, although Monica couldn't see her. You're right. I can't just keep guessing. I need to know exactly what we're dealing with. The phone call ended, and Eleanor stood still for a long moment, feeling the weight of her next steps. She needed answers, but she also needed to be careful. Her next move could change everything. The sound of small footsteps outside her door brought her back to the present. Before she could move, the door opened, and Caleb's small figure appeared in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes wide. Grandma? His voice trembled, and Eleanor felt a pang of guilt twist inside her. She had been so focused on everything else, she hadn't noticed how much he was struggling. Caleb, she said softly, standing up. What is it, sweetheart? I don't want you to go, he whispered, his hands wringing together. I don't like it. It's scary. Eleanor's heart cracked. She knelt down in front of him, brushing his hair back gently. You don't have to worry, darling. We'll figure this out, okay? But right now, I need you to be strong for me too. We're going to stay close, just a little while longer. Caleb nodded slowly, but his eyes never left her face. I don't want you to go to that dinner. I feel safer with you. I don't want to be alone. Eleanor's heart swelled with love and sorrow. She had wanted to protect him from all of this, the lies, the tension, the uncertainty. But the truth was, she couldn't shield him forever. She needed to face what was coming. But for now, she needed him to understand that he wasn't alone. I'm not going to the dinner, Caleb, she said quietly, pulling him into a hug. I'm staying right here with you. We'll stay together. The weight of the evening pressed against her chest, but as she held Caleb close, something inside Eleanor shifted. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't know how this would end, but she couldn't keep waiting. She needed to take control, for her family's sake. But what would the next step be? How would the truth finally break free? And what would it cost them all? As Caleb clung to her, his face buried in her chest, Eleanor knew this wasn't just about David. It was about everything that had been hidden for too long, and the moment to uncover it was drawing closer. Eleanor couldn't shake the unease gnawing at her as she stepped out of the hotel and into the quiet night. The cool air bit at her skin, sharp and biting, but it did little to quell the storm raging inside her. She had seen him, the woman David had been speaking to earlier at the reception. She hadn't recognized her at the time, but something about the way David had looked at her, the way his eyes had hardened the moment they spoke, hadn't sat right with Eleanor. It was a look she knew all too well, the look of a man hiding something. Her footsteps echoed on the pavement as she walked, the glow of the streetlights casting long, uncertain shadows across her path. She needed answers. She couldn't stand in the dark any longer, not when the lies had already begun to pile up like rubble around her. And this woman, this stranger, was the key to understanding it all. Eleanor had a name now. Monica had helped her trace the woman, a former business associate of David's. Her name was Isabella Monroe. The more Eleanor thought about it, the more her stomach churned. What had been so urgent that David had to speak with her privately at the wedding? Why had he kept her presence a secret? And what did it all mean for the life he had so carefully built with Hannah? Her thoughts raced as she approached the address that Monica had helped her track down. It was a modest building tucked away in a quiet corner of town, far from the glamour of the wedding venue. As Eleanor knocked, her heart thudded in her chest. The door opened a moment later, and the woman standing in front of her was exactly as Eleanor had imagined, cool, collected, poised. Isabella Monroe exuded an air of control, her dark eyes scanning Eleanor with curiosity. "Can I help you?" Isabella asked, her tone smooth, but there was something unreadable in her gaze. Eleanor took a breath, steadying herself. "I need to talk to you. It's about David Gray." The mention of David's name caused a subtle shift in Isabella's expression, but she recovered quickly. "What about him?" Her voice had a sharp edge now, though she kept her composure intact. "I know you were close with him. Too close, apparently," Eleanor replied, her voice quieter but no less resolute. "I saw the two of you speaking at the wedding. He's hiding something, and I think you're part of it. Isabella's lips twisted into a small, knowing smile. David and I go way back. We work together, yes, but what's the real issue here? She stepped back slightly, as if inviting Eleanor to step inside. You've come all this way. Let's talk. Reluctantly, Eleanor followed her inside. The apartment was minimalist. Clean lines, sparse furniture, a few framed photographs on the wall. It was a world away from the opulence of the wedding. She couldn't help but feel a pang of unease. This was where David had come to when no one else was watching, where he had hidden the parts of his life he didn't want others to see. Isabella poured a drink, a gesture that felt both too familiar and too cold. She handed one to Eleanor, who took it, though her fingers trembled. I know you're not here to discuss business, Isabella said, leaning against the counter. Her gaze was sharp, searching. You want to know about me and David, don't you? Eleanor's heart hammered in her chest. What was your relationship with him? Why does he keep you in the shadows? Isabella took a long sip from her glass before answering, her voice calm but laced with something Eleanor couldn't quite place. David and I were more than just business partners. We were involved, romantically, at the start. It was brief, but intense. But then he moved on. It wasn't easy, but I understood. He was with Hannah by then. Isabella's eyes darkened as she leaned forward slightly. But I never stopped caring for him, Eleanor, and I know he still thinks about me. He's never truly let go. Eleanor felt the ground shift beneath her feet as Isabella's words sank in. Romantically involved. She had been right all along. The man Hannah was about to marry hadn't just kept secrets from her. He'd lived a life of deception, even during his relationship with her. This was bigger than she had imagined. Not only had David betrayed his fiancée, but he had kept this woman, a woman he had shared a deep connection with, close enough to remain in his life. And what did that say about their future? About everything Eleanor had trusted? I'm sorry, Eleanor said softly, her hands tightening around her glass. But you don't seem sorry. You seem to know exactly what he's capable of, what he's hiding. Isabella's lips curled into a faint smile. I know David better than most, and I know he hasn't told Hannah everything. But you won't be the one to expose it. He's too smart. He'll cover his tracks. You can't get to the truth that easily. The coldness in her tone made Eleanor's blood run cold. She didn't know whether she was angry or scared, but the gnawing feeling of betrayal was too much to ignore now. She had to act. She had to confront David with everything she had, but something told her it wasn't the right moment. Not yet. Instead, Eleanor took out her phone, dialing a number she hadn't used in years. Charlie, David's longtime family friend. He'd helped Eleanor and her late husband through difficult times before, and now she needed him more than ever. She spoke to him briefly, asking him to look deeper into David's financial records and connections. She needed to understand how far David's secrets went. As the call ended, Eleanor turned back to Isabella, her resolve hardening. She had uncovered one piece of the puzzle, but there was more to uncover, and she wasn't going to let David, or anyone else, keep her family in the dark any longer. Just then, as Eleanor moved toward the door, Caleb's small voice echoed in her mind. Are you going to tell Hannah about David's secret? She paused, her hand on the doorknob, her heart heavy. The consequences of revealing the truth were too great, too uncertain. She couldn't risk it all, not yet, not until she knew everything. With a final glance at Isabella, Eleanor stepped into the night, the weight of the truth still looming over her, uncertain and dangerous, but undeniable. It was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. Eleanor sat across from David in the quiet, dimly lit lounge of the hotel, the remnants of the wedding celebration echoing in the distance, laughter, glasses clinking, music faintly drifting through the air. It all felt like a cruel joke now. The reality of the situation pressed heavily on her chest, her pulse quickening with every breath. The time for pretending was over. The facade was crumbling. She had to know the truth, and David was going to tell her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, the vibrating screen reminding her of the information Charlie had uncovered. Financial records, connections, discrepancies. Eleanor tried to push the nagging unease aside, but she couldn't shake the sense that the deeper she dug, the more horrifying the truth would be. David sat across from her, his features still composed, his demeanor cold but practiced. He had become adept at hiding his emotions, at playing the role of the calm, controlled man. But Eleanor could see through it now, see the cracks in his armor, the nervous twitch in his jaw when his eyes flickered too quickly away from hers. "David," she began, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "I know you lied to me." He raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a forced smile. "Eleanor, what are you talking about?" "The night you were supposed to be with Isabella Monroe," she pressed, leaning forward slightly. "I've checked the alibi you gave me. It doesn't add up." For the first time, his eyes flashed with something. Fear, perhaps, or the realization that his carefully constructed world was about to collapse. But he quickly regained his composure, his voice calm and dismissive. "I don't know what you've heard, but I was with a colleague that night. We had a meeting. A business discussion. That's all it was." Eleanor didn't buy it. Her gut told her it was all fabricated. She'd seen how he reacted when she mentioned Isabella's name, how defensive he'd become. The lie was thin, barely covering the truth, and she wasn't about to let him slip away with it. "David," she said slowly, her voice cold with a resolve she hadn't known she had. "Charlie looked into your financial records. You've been hiding things from everyone, not just me, not just Hannah. Money laundering, embezzlement. You've been deceiving people for years." David's face remained unchanged, but she saw the briefest flicker in his eyes. It was a flash of panic, masked by practiced control. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his drink, then set it down carefully, as if the motion might buy him some time. "Eleanor, I don't know what Charlie's told you, but you're wrong. This is all a misunderstanding." The calmness in his voice was sickening now, a thin veil over the truth she had uncovered. The financial discrepancies were there, too many of them to ignore. But it wasn't just the money. It was everything that had come before, everything he had hidden in plain sight. The lies, the manipulation, the relationships. She leaned forward, her eyes never leaving his. "David, don't lie to me. Not now. Not when everything is on the line. What else have you been hiding?" His lips pressed together in a tight line, and for a moment, Eleanor thought he might say something, anything. But instead, he simply shook his head, his eyes flashing with a mix of frustration and something darker. "You're making a huge mistake," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "You think you're protecting your daughter, but you're not. You're just making things worse. Hannah will never forgive you if you do this." Eleanor swallowed hard, her throat tight with the weight of his words. She could hear the underlying threat in his tone, the way he tried to turn it all back on her. But she couldn't afford to flinch. Not now. Not when she knew too much. "David, you're not the man I thought you were," she whispered, more to herself than to him, the sting of betrayal raw in her chest. "I've spent years believing in you, protecting you, and this is what you've become." He didn't answer immediately. Instead, his eyes shifted toward the door, as if considering an escape. But there was no way out. Not anymore. Eleanor stood up suddenly, her body taut with frustration and rage. She needed answers. She needed to stop him from lying, needed to stop him from destroying everything her family had built. But as she looked at him, the man who had deceived her daughter, her own flesh and blood, a new fear settled in her chest. The damage had already been done. The cracks were there, and nothing would ever be the same again. She walked to the window, staring out at the city below, her mind reeling with everything she had uncovered. But even as she stood there, something inside of her began to shift. She had spent so long trying to protect her family from the truth, but now she realized that protecting them from it had only hurt them more. The door opened behind her, and she turned to see Hannah standing in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide with concern. "Mom," she said softly, "what's going on?" "What are you talking to David about?" Eleanor felt a pang of guilt, but it was overshadowed by the overwhelming need to protect her daughter. This was the moment where everything changed. She could no longer shield Hannah from the truth. But could she bear to tell her? Could she expose David for what he really was, knowing the devastation it would cause? Hannah, Eleanor said quietly, walking toward her daughter, I need to tell you something. About David. Something you need to hear. Something he's been hiding from all of us. Hannah stepped back, her breath catching in her throat. What is it, Mom? Eleanor paused, the weight of the words pressing on her tongue. She had made the choice. There was no turning back. It's worse than you think, she said softly, her voice trembling with the truth she could no longer keep hidden. The morning after the confrontation felt surreal. The hotel room was quiet, the sun casting pale light across the marble floors. Eleanor sat by the window, staring out at the city, her thoughts swirling in a haze of exhaustion, guilt, and resolve. Last night, she had finally come face to face with the truth. David's lies weren't just about cheating or emotional manipulation. He was deep into something far darker: fraud, money laundering, embezzlement. The man she had welcomed into her family, the man her daughter had fallen in love with, was a stranger. Worse, he had been hiding his true self for years, and now it was all falling apart. Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she held the phone to her ear, her mind replaying the moments from last night. The conversation with Isabella, the woman who had been more than just a business partner to David, had confirmed it all. David had been involved in fraudulent activities for years, she had said, her words calm and controlled. But Isabella had made it clear. Her involvement had been a small part of a much larger, more dangerous scheme. The weight of it all pressed heavily on Eleanor's chest, suffocating her as she leaned back in the chair, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. She had promised to protect Hannah, to keep her safe from the truth. But how could she keep this secret any longer? The lies had already poisoned everything, and the longer she waited, the more damage it would do. Eleanor? Monica's voice cut through the silence, pulling her back from the precipice of her thoughts. I'm here, Monica, she replied, her voice hoarse, barely a whisper. You sound distant. What's going on? Have you talked to Hannah yet? Monica's concern was palpable through the phone. Eleanor hesitated, her eyes closing, as the weight of what she knew settled deeper into her bones. I haven't told her yet. I don't know if I can. If I tell her the truth about David, everything, I'll ruin her. It will destroy her. She's about to marry him, Monica. She loves him. Monica's voice softened. You've known David for years, Eleanor. You've seen the man he really is, but Hannah hasn't. And if you don't tell her now, you risk losing her trust forever. It's a painful truth, but she deserves to know, even if it hurts her. Especially if it hurts her. Eleanor swallowed hard, her chest tightening at the thought of hurting her daughter. I know you're right. But how do I even begin? How do I tell her the man she's about to marry is not the man she thinks he is? Start with the facts, Eleanor. Give her the truth. She'll need time to process, but she'll need you more than ever when it all comes out. You've been strong enough to protect her from the lies, but you can't protect her from the truth. Eleanor exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of Monica's words settle deep into her heart. She couldn't keep running. She couldn't keep shielding Hannah from the reality that had already begun to suffocate them both. As she ended the call, her mind flashed to Caleb. He hadn't said much since the wedding, but she had noticed the shift in him. He was perceptive, too perceptive for his age, and it was clear that he had seen something in David's behavior that unsettled him. He had already told Eleanor that he didn't want to attend the wedding anymore. He couldn't stand the lies. Eleanor's heart ached at the thought of him, his small face etched with worry. He didn't understand the complexities of David's deceit, but he understood enough to know that things weren't right. How could she explain to him why his mother was so upset, why David was so dangerous? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She opened it to find Caleb standing there, his eyes filled with a mix of confusion and fear. Grandma, he said softly, his voice small but strong. Are you going to tell Mom? Are you going to tell her about David? Eleanor's heart twisted. She knelt down to his level, placing a hand on his small shoulder. I don't know yet, sweetheart, she said quietly, but I promise you, I'll tell her when the time is right. Caleb's eyes were wide, and his hands twisted together nervously. I don't want her to get hurt. I don't want to go to the wedding anymore, Grandma. It feels wrong. Eleanor's chest tightened with an overwhelming mix of sorrow and pride. He was too young to carry this burden, but he already understood, and he was right. Everything felt wrong. "I understand, Caleb," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But sometimes, even when things feel wrong, we have to face them. We can't keep hiding from the truth. I promise you, we'll make it right. Just a little while longer, okay? We have to wait for the right moment." He nodded slowly, his small face full of uncertainty, but he hugged her tightly before retreating back to his room. Eleanor stood there for a moment, the weight of her promises pressing down on her. She had a choice to make. She could protect Hannah for a little longer, keep her in the dark, shield her from the truth. But that wouldn't be fair to her. It wouldn't be fair to any of them. Her decision had been made. She would confront David one last time, but this time it would be different. This time, she wouldn't let him lie his way out of it. She would expose him, expose everything. But before she did, there was one more thing she had to do. She couldn't go into this blind. She needed legal advice. She needed to understand the full scope of David's deceit. Eleanor dialed the number she had been avoiding, Frank Delaney, her late husband's lawyer. It was time to bring in the experts. The phone rang, and Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest. When Frank answered, his voice was warm, but professional, as always. "Frank, I need your help," Eleanor said, her voice firm, no longer wavering. "It's about David. I need to know what legal options I have before I expose him. Things are far worse than I imagined." There was a long pause, then Frank's voice came through, serious. "I'll help you, Eleanor. But this is going to get complicated. Are you sure you're ready for what comes next?" Eleanor closed her eyes, her mind racing with the consequences of the decision she had already made. She wasn't ready, but she had no choice. The storm was coming, and there was no turning back. The reception was in full swing, but to Eleanor, the laughter and music seemed distant, muted by the storm raging inside her. Guests mingled in clusters, exchanging pleasantries, their voices blending into a hum of polite conversation. The air was thick with champagne and floral scents, but all Eleanor could smell was the weight of the truth pressing down on her chest. She stood by the bar, watching David from across the room. He was engaged in a quiet conversation with a group of well-dressed guests, but his eyes darted nervously toward the door every few seconds. Eleanor noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands fidgeted with the edge of his glass, the subtle shift in his posture whenever someone spoke too loudly or too closely. He was on edge. Something was clearly wrong. Then, just as she was about to take a step forward, Eleanor saw it. His phone. It buzzed in his pocket, and without a second thought, he excused himself from the conversation. He stepped into a quieter corner of the ballroom, his back to the crowd, speaking in hushed tones. His voice was low and clipped, too controlled, but Eleanor could hear the unease threading through his words. The phone call seemed urgent, but not in the way David wanted anyone to know. He kept glancing over his shoulder, checking for an escape. His body language betrayed him, tense, coiled, like a man caught in a lie, trying to hide it from the world. Eleanor's heart raced in her chest. She was done waiting. This was it. She had given him every chance to come clean, every opportunity to tell the truth. But now she knew. The truth would never come from him willingly. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. The room felt too large, too filled with people who were blissfully unaware of the chaos that had already begun to unravel. But Eleanor could no longer pretend. She could no longer remain silent while this man, this stranger, continued to lie to her daughter and everyone around them. Without another moment's hesitation, Eleanor stood tall and walked toward David. She didn't hesitate when she reached the center of the room. She didn't let the noise of the reception overwhelm her. She simply stood in front of him, the truth burning in her chest like fire, and said calmly, deliberately, "David, it's time we told everyone the truth." The words hung in the air like a punch. The room went quiet, as though time itself had momentarily stopped. Eleanor could feel all eyes shifting toward her, and then toward David. He froze, his face a mask of shock and panic. The color drained from his face as he turned to her, his eyes wide with disbelief. His mouth opened, but no words came out at first. Then, his hand gripped his drink harder, his knuckles whitening, as if he were trying to hold on to the illusion, the facade that he'd spent years building. "Eleanor, this isn't the time," David started, but his voice faltered, barely a whisper. "No," Eleanor cut him off, her voice even, unwavering. "It's exactly the time." Her gaze never left him as she stood her ground, feeling the weight of everything she had uncovered pressing down on her with every passing second. "The truth has been hiding in plain sight for too long. You've been lying to Hannah, to this entire family, and I won't stand by while you keep pretending." David's gaze flickered nervously around the room. The guests were still watching, confused, waiting. The tension in the air was palpable, thick, heavy, like a storm was about to break. "I don't know what you're talking about," David said, his voice rising a fraction. His calm, collected exterior was cracking, the facade crumbling beneath the weight of her words. "This isn't what you think." Eleanor shook her head. "Don't even try, David. I know about the money laundering, the embezzlement. I know about your past, about Isabella." Her voice didn't waver. She wasn't going to let him control the narrative any longer. The silence that followed was deafening. Guests exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to speak or remain still. The music had stopped. The hum of conversation faded to a distant echo. The tension in the room was so thick, it felt like they were all holding their breath. David took a step back, his eyes darting around the room as though he were searching for a way out. But there was no escape this time. His charm, his practiced calm, it was all slipping away. He was exposed, his lies laid bare, and Eleanor wasn't going to let him hide from it any longer. "You don't know what you're doing," David said, his voice low, his hands shaking slightly as he clenched the edge of the bar. He was defensive now, his composure cracking under the pressure. "You think exposing me will protect Hannah, but you're wrong. You'll ruin everything. She'll never forgive you for this." The words stung, but Eleanor didn't flinch. She couldn't afford to. "She deserves the truth, David," she replied calmly, her voice unwavering. "If I don't tell her now, I'll lose her forever. You've already lost her, whether you know it or not." David looked around again, his expression desperate, as though he were trying to find someone who would come to his defense, someone who would tell him that this wasn't happening. But no one spoke. No one moved. The truth was too loud now to ignore. Eleanor stood firm, knowing this was the culmination of everything she had discovered. She had given David every opportunity to come clean, but he had refused. Now, it was time for him to face the consequences of his actions. And then, just as the silence began to stretch on, Hannah stepped into the room. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with confusion. She must have heard the commotion, must have felt the tension shift. "Mom?" she asked softly, her voice trembling, her gaze flickering between Eleanor and David. "What's going on? What are you saying?" The truth had been exposed, but now came the hardest part. Would Hannah believe her? Would she understand? Eleanor took a deep breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's time you knew everything, sweetheart." The room was frozen in time, suspended in a silence that pulsed with an intensity that made Eleanor's pulse race. David's face had drained of color, his usually confident posture now brittle, frail. He was still standing by the bar, but his body seemed to have shrunk into itself, his shoulders tight, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. The weight of the accusations, the truth that had just been exposed, was too much for him to bear, and Eleanor could see it in his eyes, the flicker of panic, the tightening around his jaw. David opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out at first. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously around the room, looking for an escape that wasn't there. He was cornered. The lies he had woven so carefully over the years were unraveling before his eyes, and there was no way to hide from it now. "You don't understand," David finally managed, his voice cracking as he tried to regain some control. "This is all a misunderstanding. You don't know what you're talking about." Eleanor's calm, steady demeanor remained unbroken. She wasn't shaking, though everything inside her was. She had come so far, done so much to uncover this truth, and now she was going to finish what she'd started. "I know everything, David," Eleanor replied, her voice unwavering. "I know about the money laundering, the embezzlement. The lies you've told not just to me, but to Hannah, to everyone who's trusted you." Her words hit like a physical blow. The room seemed to tighten around her as she spoke, her voice the only sound cutting through the stillness. Guests glanced at each other, unsure whether to speak, unsure whether they had heard her right. The disbelief in their eyes was palpable, but it didn't matter. The truth was there, undeniable, hanging between them like an invisible weight. David's eyes shifted toward the floor for a split second, as if he were weighing his options, trying to find a way out. He tried to steady himself, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the bar. "This isn't what it seems," he repeated, but his voice lacked the strength it once held. The veneer of charm, the mask of control, was slipping away with every word Eleanor spoke. Eleanor stepped forward, her gaze never leaving his. "It's time to stop lying, David. Everyone here deserves to know who you really are." She turned toward the group of guests who were still watching the scene unfold. "You've been lying to all of us, manipulating everyone around you to get what you want. You've been stealing, hiding, deceiving, for years." The room held its breath. The music had long since faded into silence, and the hum of conversation had died. The guests, once polite and eager to enjoy the celebration, now stood frozen, unsure how to react, unsure whether to confront David or look away. Eleanor could feel the weight of their stares, but she didn't flinch. She had come too far to back down now. David's face flushed with anger, the color rising in his cheeks, his jaw tightening with every passing second. His hands shook visibly as he set his drink down with deliberate force. "You don't know what you're talking about," he spat, his voice low, dangerous. "You think you've uncovered something, but you've got it all wrong. You think you're protecting your daughter, but you're ruining her life, Eleanor. You're destroying everything." Eleanor felt the sting of his words, but she didn't react. She had spent too many years protecting her family from the truth, from the painful reality that David was not who he claimed to be. She had kept quiet for too long. Not anymore. "You're right," Eleanor said softly, her voice steady, almost serene. "I'm not protecting her by keeping you in the dark. I'm not protecting her by letting you keep up this charade. She deserves to know the truth. And now, so does everyone else." David took another step back, his eyes wild with panic. He glanced at the door, as though he might run. But the room was closing in on him. His calculated composure was gone. Eleanor could see it in the way he stood, his body tense and desperate, the mask of control slipping more with every passing second. He looked around the room, trying to muster a defense, but the words wouldn't come. And in that moment, as his eyes met Eleanor's, filled with fear and anger, yet unable to escape the truth, he lost the battle. "This is not how it's supposed to happen," David muttered, his voice low, barely audible over the silence. "You don't understand. I did it for us, for all of us." Eleanor stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. "You did it for you, David, and you've been doing it for years. I don't know how you thought you could get away with it forever, but this ends now." Then, just as the tension in the room reached its peak, Hannah appeared in the doorway, her expression a mixture of confusion and fear. She had heard the commotion, the raised voices, and the silence that followed. Her eyes flickered from Eleanor to David, taking in the strange atmosphere. "Mom?" Hannah asked quietly, her voice trembling. Her gaze darted back and forth between her mother and David, confusion clouding her face. "What's going on? What are you saying?" Eleanor felt a deep ache in her chest as she turned to her daughter. The moment of truth had arrived. She had known this moment would come, but nothing could have prepared her for the pain of seeing the confusion in Hannah's eyes. "Hannah," Eleanor said softly, her voice cracking with emotion. She took a step closer, her heart breaking with every word. "It's time you knew everything. The man you're about to marry, he's been hiding something from you, from all of us." The words hung in the air, heavy and final, as the guests waited in stunned silence. David's eyes met Hannah's, and for the first time, Eleanor saw the desperation in his gaze. It wasn't just fear, it was regret, mixed with the anger of being exposed. Hannah's breath caught in her throat, her eyes wide with disbelief as she took a step back. "What? No, No, this can't be true. The world around them seemed to blur as Eleanor reached out to her daughter, but Hannah stepped back, her face pale, a look of devastation clouding her eyes. "You're telling me everything was a lie?" Hannah whispered, her voice breaking. The devastation in her eyes was too much for Eleanor to bear. David took a step forward, but Eleanor didn't move. She wouldn't let him escape. "Not now." "I didn't want this to happen," David muttered, his voice cracking, but it was too late. Hannah turned, her face full of anguish, and she walked out of the room, her footsteps echoing in the silence that followed her departure. Eleanor stood there, rooted to the spot, the weight of everything they had just revealed sinking in. She had done what she had to do, but as the door closed behind her daughter, the finality of it all hit her like a punch to the gut. The truth had torn their family apart. The ballroom was empty now, save for the lingering echoes of the music that once filled the air. The reception had ended in disgrace, and all that was left were the shattered fragments of a dream that had been built on lies. Eleanor stood in the corner of the grand hall, her gaze drifting over the now quiet space. She could hear her heart pounding in her chest, the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly fading into exhaustion. David had left the wedding in a flurry, his face a twisted mask of anger and humiliation, his attempts to explain himself falling flat in the face of the truth. And then Hannah, her daughter, her only child, had walked out, her footsteps heavy with disbelief and pain. She had wanted to protect her from this moment for so long, but now, as the truth unfolded, Eleanor realized that the hardest part had only just begun. Hannah hadn't returned to the ballroom. The minutes dragged on, and Eleanor, despite her own overwhelming emotions, found herself searching for her daughter. She couldn't bear the thought of Hannah being alone, lost in the mess that David had created. She had to make things right, at least for Hannah. Eleanor found her in the hotel's private garden, standing by the edge of a fountain, staring down at the water as if it could offer her answers. Her shoulders were hunched, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, the tension radiating from her like heat. "Hannah?" Eleanor's voice was gentle, but it carried the weight of everything unsaid. Hannah didn't turn around right away. She just stood there, frozen, as though trying to hold the pieces of herself together. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "How could you, Mom?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, choked with emotion. "How could you keep this from me? All this time you knew what kind of man he was. And you didn't tell me. You let me fall in love with him." Eleanor's heart broke as she stepped closer, her hand reaching out, though she didn't touch her daughter. She knew better than to rush this moment, knew better than to push when Hannah was clearly struggling to process everything. "Hannah, I never wanted to hurt you," Eleanor said softly, her voice trembling. "I thought I was protecting you. I wanted to believe David could be the man you saw in him. But I've learned things that I couldn't ignore anymore." Hannah's shoulders shook slightly, and she turned to face Eleanor, her tear-streaked face a mixture of confusion and betrayal. "You thought you were protecting me? By lying to me? By hiding everything?" "I should have told you sooner," Eleanor whispered, guilt flooding her chest. "I thought if I could just keep it together, keep the peace, that you'd never have to know. But I see now, that wasn't fair to you. And it wasn't fair to Caleb either." The mention of her little brother seemed to trigger something in Hannah. She stepped back, her face crumbling with a mix of sadness and frustration. "Caleb. I've barely seen him. He must be so confused. We're all so lost, Mom. She choked back a sob, her voice breaking. "How could I have been so blind? How could I have trusted him? You should have told me. Why didn't you?" Eleanor took a step closer, her hands trembling, as she reached for her daughter. But again, Hannah recoiled slightly, her face a mask of pain. "I didn't want to tell you, Hannah. I didn't want to destroy the dream you had. But now I realize that it was never real. He wasn't who you thought he was, and I couldn't keep pretending." "I loved him," Hannah murmured, her voice hollow. "I really thought he was the one. And now, I don't know what to believe anymore." She wiped her eyes, her breath hitching as she looked away, the rawness of her pain cutting through the quiet of the garden. "I don't know who I am without him." Eleanor stood quietly for a moment, her heart breaking for the girl standing before her, the woman she had raised, now torn apart by the lies of a man they both had trusted. She had been trying to protect her daughter, to shield her from this truth, but now she realized that protecting her from the pain of reality had only kept her in the dark. "The truth hurts," Eleanor said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "But sometimes, the hardest truths are the ones that save us. They make us see the world as it really is, not as we wish it to be. And it's painful, I know that. But you're not alone. You've never been alone, Hannah. Not now. Not ever." Hannah turned away, her gaze fixed on the fountain, the tears silently streaming down her cheeks. She didn't say anything for a long time. The silence between them felt unbearable, yet Eleanor stayed still, giving her daughter the space she needed to process. Finally, after a long moment, Hannah spoke again, her voice quiet, but filled with a mix of anger and sorrow. "I don't know what to do with all this. I don't know if I can even look at David again, let alone forgive him." Eleanor nodded, her own chest tight with the weight of everything they had just uncovered. "You don't have to figure it out now, sweetheart. Just take it one step at a time. I'm here, and I'll help you through it. Whatever you decide, we'll figure this out together." Hannah looked at her mother, her eyes red-rimmed but searching for something in Eleanor's steady gaze. "What about him, Mom? What about David?" "I don't know," Eleanor said softly. "I don't know what the future holds for him, for any of us. But right now, we need to focus on you, on what's best for you, and for Caleb." Just then, as if on cue, Caleb appeared in the doorway, his small figure standing just outside the garden, his eyes wide with curiosity. He stepped forward, his tiny footsteps almost inaudible against the stillness of the evening. "Grandma?" he asked quietly, his voice calm but steady for someone so young. "Is everything okay now?" Eleanor's heart swelled with a mix of sadness and pride. Her little boy, who had been so attuned to the unspoken tensions in the air, was still holding on to hope, still trusting in her. She walked toward him, her arms open, and he ran into them, his small frame pressing against her as if he were seeking solace from the storm that had torn through their lives. Eleanor knelt down, wrapping him in her embrace, feeling the weight of the moment press down on her shoulders. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with pain, confusion, and heartache. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel so alone. "We'll get through this, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice filled with quiet resolve. Hannah stepped forward, wiping her eyes, and for the first time in hours, there was a faint glimmer of understanding in her gaze. The journey ahead would be long, and the wounds were still fresh. But perhaps, just perhaps, they could heal, together. Eleanor sat alone in the quiet of her hotel room, the sun casting a pale glow through the curtains, its light spilling over the floor in soft, muted hues. Her mind felt heavy, clouded by the weight of what had happened in the hours since the confrontation. She had been on the edge of everything, on the edge of exposing the truth, of tearing apart a life that had once seemed so perfect. But now that the storm had passed and the silence had settled in, she could hardly breathe. Her phone buzzed once, then again. It was Charlie. He had called her earlier with news that she had hoped to avoid, but she couldn't put it off any longer. She swiped to answer, her finger trembling slightly as she held the phone to her ear. "Eleanor." Charlie's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now, something she hadn't heard before. "I've been digging into David's financials like you asked. I found something more than just the fraud and embezzlement. David's been involved in more illegal activities than we imagined. I'm talking about money laundering, tax evasion, possibly even racketeering. He's buried deep, Eleanor, and if anyone finds out, there could be criminal charges." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, the world around her seemed to tilt. Criminal charges. David wasn't just a liar. He was a criminal, and his actions had gone far beyond what she had ever imagined. He had not only betrayed their trust, he had jeopardized everything they had built. "Are you sure?" Eleanor asked, her voice a whisper, though her throat felt tight. She didn't want to believe it. She didn't want to face the reality of what David had done. But in her gut, she knew it was true. I've got the documentation, Eleanor, Charlie continued. It's all there. If you want to press charges, this could lead to an investigation. This could ruin him, and everyone involved. Eleanor closed her eyes, leaning back against the bed. She could feel the weight of the decision in the pit of her stomach, a heaviness that threatened to crush her. She had always believed in doing what was right. But now, with the truth laid bare, she found herself at a crossroads, between exposing the full extent of David's crimes and allowing him to try to rebuild his life, no matter how broken it might be. "Thank you, Charlie," she said softly, her voice trembling with the weight of what she had just learned. "I'll think about it. I need to make sure I understand everything before I decide what to do next." After the call ended, Eleanor remained still for a long while, the silence enveloping her like a heavy fog. She couldn't stop thinking about what it would mean for Hannah, what it would mean for the family. If she exposed David, the fallout would be devastating. Hannah had already suffered enough. How could she be expected to face the reality of who David truly was? Yet, how could she let him walk away without facing the consequences of his actions? Her mind wandered back to Caleb, who had been the quiet observer throughout this entire ordeal. He had seen it all, felt it all, and yet, despite his age, he had somehow grasped the magnitude of what was happening. His steady presence had been a source of comfort to Eleanor, even as her world had spiraled out of control. She had promised to protect him, but she realized now that her role as a grandmother was so much more than that. It was about teaching him the importance of doing what was right, even when it was hard. The weight of the decision pulled her deeper into her thoughts, and as the minutes stretched on, she knew she had to act. She couldn't let David's lies go unchallenged. She couldn't allow him to continue manipulating everyone around him, especially Hannah. It was time for justice, no matter what it cost her. Eleanor took a deep breath and grabbed her phone once more. This time, she dialed Frank Delaney, her late husband's trusted lawyer. She had been avoiding the call for days, afraid of what he might say, but now she knew she had no choice. "Frank," she said, her voice resolute despite the shakiness she felt inside. "I need your help. I've just learned something about David, something that goes far beyond what I thought I knew. I need to know what my options are before I decide how to move forward. This isn't just about him anymore. It's about what's best for our family." Frank's voice was calm, reassuring, as always. "I understand, Eleanor. We'll get through this, step by step. Let's take a look at everything you have, and we'll make sure you understand the legal ramifications. This isn't just a personal issue anymore. It's criminal, and we need to handle it carefully." The conversation ended, but the weight of the decision still hung heavy in the air. As Eleanor sat there, the gravity of what she was about to do settled in. She knew this would tear apart everything. It would rip at the heart of the family she had worked so hard to protect. But it was the right thing. She couldn't allow David to destroy more lives, especially not her daughter's. Eleanor stood up, pacing the room, her mind racing. The walls felt as if they were closing in, but she didn't back down. The truth had already torn through their lives, like a whirlwind, and there was no escaping it now. She had made her decision. David would face the consequences of his actions, and she would make sure of it. No more secrets, no more lies. And as for Hannah, she would stand by her. She would help her rebuild her life, help her heal from the pain that David's deceit had caused. Eleanor knew that her role as a mother, a grandmother, was to guide her family through the storm. And it was time to face the storm head-on. The consequences were uncertain, the path ahead unclear. But Eleanor was ready to fight for what was right, ready to do whatever it took to make sure her family could heal, even if it meant confronting the darkest truths of all. The final decision had been made. The morning light filtered through the half-drawn curtains, casting long, pale shadows across the room. The house felt quieter than usual, the absence of David's presence almost palpable. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, the warmth of the mug a stark contrast to the chill that had settled in her bones. The events of the past few days played over and over in her mind, the confrontation, the fallout, the irreversible truths. And now, sitting in the silence, it felt like the calm after the storm, a storm that had left everything changed, scattered, and uncertain. Hannah entered the room quietly, her face drawn, the weariness in her eyes still too raw to hide. She had spent the morning in her room, her mind heavy with the decision she had made. Eleanor had been waiting for this moment, dreading it, but now, as her daughter stood before her, she knew the hardest part had already been done. "Hannah," Eleanor said softly, setting her tea aside, her voice filled with quiet resolve. "We need to talk about what comes next." Hannah nodded, her lips pressed together in a thin line. She sat down opposite Eleanor, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The weight of the conversation hung between them, but for the first time in days, there was a sense of calm. They were no longer hiding, no longer pretending. "I'm ready, Mom," Hannah said, her voice hoarse. "I've thought about it a lot, and I know what I have to do. I can't let David keep running away from this. It's not just about me anymore. It's about what he's done to all of us." Eleanor's heart ached as she looked at her daughter. The decision wasn't easy, but it was the only way to regain control, to reclaim their lives. "I'm so proud of you," she said quietly, her voice full of emotion. "This isn't going to be easy, but it's the right thing to do." Hannah took a deep breath, her shoulders sagging as the weight of her decision settled in. "I don't know how to look at him the same way again. I don't know how to forgive him." "You don't have to forgive him right away, sweetheart," Eleanor said gently. "This isn't about forgiveness. This is about facing the truth, about healing. And you don't have to do it alone. I'm here, every step of the way." A tear slipped down Hannah's cheek, but she quickly wiped it away, her eyes meeting her mother's with a mixture of determination and sorrow. "I'll press charges. With your support, I can do this, but it's not going to be easy." "I'll be right beside you," Eleanor said, reaching across the table to take her daughter's hand. "We'll do this together, no matter how difficult it gets." They sat in silence for a moment, the reality of their decision settling in. It wasn't just about David anymore. It was about rebuilding, healing, and finding a way to move forward, even when everything felt shattered. The door creaked open, and Caleb appeared in the doorway, his small figure standing there hesitantly, his wide eyes searching their faces. Despite the turmoil that had swept through their lives, Caleb remained the steady presence they both needed. His innocence, his simple clarity, had been a balm to Eleanor's wounded heart. "Grandma?" Caleb asked softly, his voice carrying a maturity beyond his years. "Is everything going to be okay?" Eleanor's heart twisted. "We'll be okay, sweetheart," she said, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "It's going to take time, but we'll be okay." Caleb walked into the room, his small hand reaching out for both of them. Eleanor pulled him into her arms, and for a moment, she let herself sink into the comfort of his embrace. She had been his protector, but now, in this moment, she realized he was giving her the strength she needed. Hannah stood and walked over, kneeling down to meet her brother's gaze. She smiled faintly, brushing his hair from his forehead. "You've been so brave, Caleb. You've seen a lot, and I know it's been hard, but you're not alone. We're all in this together." Caleb smiled, his innocent faith in them unwavering. "I know, Mom, Grandma. I know we'll be okay." Eleanor looked at her children, her heart full of love and pride. The road ahead would be long, filled with pain, anger, and grief. But she could see it now, the path forward, the possibility of healing. It wouldn't be easy, and they couldn't undo the damage that had been done, but together, they could rebuild. "Hannah, Caleb," Eleanor began, her voice strong, "we've been through a lot, but we've made it this far. We'll keep going. It won't be easy, but we'll take it one step at a time. We're not just a family anymore. We're a team." Hannah nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "I'm ready, Mom. I'll need time, but I know what I have to do." Eleanor's gaze shifted to Caleb, whose steady presence had become their anchor in the storm. "You're right," she said softly. "We are a team, and we'll stick together, no matter what." As they sat there, united, Eleanor knew the real work had only just begun. They would face the consequences of David's betrayal, but they would do it with strength, with integrity, and with each other. There was no going back, but there was a future to look forward to, a future where trust could be rebuilt and love could heal. And as the day began to unfold, with the weight of their decision hanging in the air, Eleanor knew one thing for sure. This was the beginning of their recovery, and whatever came next, they would face it together. The letter was still in her hands. Eleanor stared at the carefully folded paper, the words inside a mix of apology and deflection. David's handwriting was elegant, but it carried none of the warmth she'd once believed it did. She had read it over and over again, each line an attempt to rewrite the past, to reframe the damage he'd done. "I'm sorry, Eleanor," it began. "I never meant to hurt you or your family. I've made mistakes, but I want to make things right." It wasn't the apology she had hoped for. It wasn't the kind of apology that could heal what had been shattered. No amount of words could undo the years of lies, of manipulation, of betrayal. Yet, Eleanor's grip on the letter tightened as she looked out the window, the morning light casting long shadows across the floor. She had never expected closure from David, nor had she ever wanted it. In truth, his apology meant little now. He had already shown her who he truly was. But as she read the last line, "Please forgive me," Eleanor felt an unexpected sense of calm. It was over. His hold over them had finally ended. She crumpled the letter and tossed it into the wastebasket without a second thought. That chapter was closed. It had been weeks since the confrontation, weeks since the phone calls, the meetings with the lawyer, the quiet nights spent trying to process what had happened. And yet, it still felt as though the pieces were falling into place. Hannah was still healing, still learning to trust herself again, but Eleanor could see the change. The darkness in her eyes was starting to fade, replaced by a quiet strength that Eleanor recognized, strength that came not from revenge, but from understanding. Hannah had made her decision. She had pressed charges against David, and though the legal process was far from over, Eleanor knew that they had both made the right choice. The first few days after the decision had been the hardest. Hannah had pulled away, retreating into herself, but Eleanor had respected her space, knowing the weight of betrayal ran deeper than any of them could have imagined. Slowly, however, Hannah began to open up again. They talked about the future, about what it meant to heal, about how they would move forward. There was still so much work to do, so much rebuilding that needed to happen, but the foundation was starting to take shape, and through it all, Caleb was their anchor. Despite the turmoil, Caleb had been a steady, quiet presence in their lives. His wisdom was as simple as it was profound. He had watched his family fall apart, but instead of retreating into fear, he held his mother and grandmother together. His small hands had been there to comfort them when the nights were too long, when the silence felt too loud. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Caleb turned to Eleanor with his wide, trusting eyes and simply said, "We're going to be okay, Grandma. I know we are." Eleanor had smiled, her heart swelling. His confidence was a balm to her soul, a reminder that no matter how broken things seemed, there was still hope for the future. The family had begun to heal, but Eleanor knew it would be a long road. The scars of betrayal would never fade completely, but they could learn to live with them. They would find new ways to build trust, new ways to love. Each day, they grew stronger, and though it wasn't the life they had imagined, it was theirs, and that was enough. And then there was the small, quiet moments when Eleanor found herself watching Caleb as he played in the yard, or as he sat at the table doing his homework. In those moments, the weight of everything that had happened lifted, if only for a second. She realized that the life she had worked so hard to protect, her family, her children, was still there. It had changed, yes, but it was still hers. She had chosen peace over revenge. She had chosen to move forward, to rebuild, to focus on the things that mattered. As Eleanor sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the evening sky turn to dusk, she thought about the years ahead. There would be challenges, no doubt. The road ahead wasn't easy, but now she understood that strength didn't always come from confrontation. Sometimes, the strongest thing a person could do was choose to let go of the anger, to step away from the past, and to focus on the future. She had learned that her family's future didn't depend on David's apology or his consequences. It depended on their own ability to heal, to learn from the pain, and to love one another through it all. The wind whispered through the trees, and Eleanor closed her eyes, letting the peace of the moment settle deep inside her. Her journey had been hard, her heart had been broken. But in choosing peace, in choosing to let go of the anger that had held her captive, she had found something she never expected, a quiet strength, a sense of clarity, a peace that she could finally hold on to. And with that, she knew that the future was still in her hands, and it was a future worth fighting for. I chose peace over revenge, and in that choice, I found the strength I never knew I had.